Chapter 1. The Bride Who Did Not Rise. The village of St. Mary Mead had seen weddings before, and it had seen funerals before, but it had never, in living memory, seen the two arrive on the same morning, wearing the same dress. It was Miss Jane Marple who first remarked, over the vicarage garden wall, that there was something curiously wrong with the light in the windows of Ash Grange. She had been clipping the errant tendrils of a climbing rose when she noticed that the curtains of the bridal chamber, which ought by 8:30 to have been thrown wide for the greatest day of Evelina Prentice's life, remained drawn fast, and that no sound of laughter or hurried footsteps carried across the lane. "It is unlike Ellen Farrow to be idle on a morning such as this," she said to the vicar's wife, who had come out to admire the roses, and found herself instead recruited into a small, quiet worry. Ellen Farrow was the housemaid at the Grange, a girl not given to lying abed, and certainly not on the day her mistress was to be married. By 9 o'clock the worry had travelled, as worries do in small villages, from garden wall to garden wall, until it reached the ears of Constable Palk, who found it his unhappy duty to knock upon the door of Ash Grange and receive no answer. By 9:30 the door had been forced, and by 10 the news was abroad that Evelina Prentice, aged 29, spinster of this parish, and bride-to-be of Mr. Gerald Hartnell, lay dead upon the counterpane of her own bed, dressed in the wedding gown she had meant to wear to church, her hands folded with a neatness that seemed, to those who saw her, almost unbearably deliberate. There was no wound upon her, there was no glass overturned, no bottle of any suspicious character upon the nightstand, no note left for the grieving to puzzle over. She might have been asleep but for the stillness, and but for a faint discoloration about the lips that Dr. Haydock, summoned in haste, did not like at all. "Some manner of poison," he said to Inspector Slack, who had motored over from the county town, with the particular briskness of a man who resents having his Saturday interrupted. "I shall know more when I have made a proper examination. But I will say this, it was not a natural death, and it was not, I think, a hasty one. Whoever did this had time and nerve, and no small knowledge of what he was about." Miss Marple, who had accompanied the vicar's wife on an errand of comfort to the housekeeper, and had thereby found herself, entirely by accident of course, in the hall of Ash Grange when these words were spoken, said nothing at all, but she noted, with the same quiet attention she gave to the behaviour of garden birds, that Mr. Gerald Hartnell, the bridegroom who was not to be a bridegroom after all, stood a little apart from the general commotion, his face composed into an expression of grief that struck her, for reasons she could not yet put a name to, as very slightly too well arranged. She noted also that Evelina's aunt, Mrs. Constance Prentice, who had raised the girl since the death of her parents, and who ought by rights to have been prostrate with sorrow, was instead occupied in a low and urgent conversation with the family solicitor, Mr. Aldous Renfield, in the window embrasure of the morning-room, and that the word "will" passed between them not once but twice, in tones too hushed for innocence. It was the sort of thing that meant nothing at all, or else it meant a great deal, and Miss Marple, who had spent a long life in the patient cultivation of village gossip, as another woman might cultivate delphiniums, resolved to find out which. The wedding guests, who had begun to arrive at St. Mary Mead Church in their best hats and gloves entirely ignorant of the tragedy, were turned away at the lich gate by a white-faced verger, and the flowers that had been so carefully arranged along the aisle, white roses, at Evelina's particular request, for she had always been fond of white, were left to wilt where they stood, a small and pointless cruelty that seemed, somehow, to distress the village more than almost anything else in that dreadful day. By evening the story had travelled further still, gathering embellishments as it went, so that by the time it reached the more distant farms it had acquired elements of poison rings, jilted lovers, and a curse laid upon the house of Prentice 3 generations back, none of which, Miss Marple reflected with some asperity, had the smallest foundation in fact, though she did not doubt that somewhere within the tangle of nonsense there might be a single thread of truth, waiting to be drawn out. She was an old woman, by the reckoning of most who saw her only across a teacup, given to knitting and to a fondness for the Times crossword, and to opinions about the younger generation that she was not shy of sharing. But she had buried more secrets than she had ever spoken of, and she had learned, over 60 years of watching human nature at close range, in a small place where nothing could long stay hidden, that murder, however strange its dress, always wore beneath it the same plain and dreadfully ordinary face. She thought of Evelina Prentice lying so neatly upon her bed, in the gown meant for joy, and of Gerald Hartnell's face composed a shade too carefully, and of the word will passing between an aunt and a solicitor, while the girl's body was scarcely cold. "There is a great deal here," she murmured to herself, gathering up her knitting, "that does not add up at all, and I confess I should like very much to know why." There was, too, the small matter of the ring. Evelina had worn, since her 18th birthday, a slender band, set with a single garnet, a gift from her late mother, and it was a piece she was known never to remove, not for gardening, not for sleep, not for the washing of dishes when the household was short-handed, as country households so often were. Miss Marple, permitted a brief and melancholy moment beside the bed, before the undertaker's men were sent for, noticed that the hand folded so neatly upon the girl's breast bore no ring at all, and that the finger, which should have carried it, showed none of the faint, permanent mark that 25 years of constant wear generally leaves upon flesh. She said nothing of this to anyone at the time, for it was the sort of small, uncertain observation that a sensible woman does not trumpet abroad before she has had leisure to consider its meaning, but she folded it away in her memory nonetheless. In the same careful manner she folded away a difficult stitch pattern until she had leisure to puzzle it out properly. She walked home that evening by the churchyard path, as was her habit, and paused a while by the low wall to look back at the lighted windows of Ash Grange, where the business of death was even now being conducted with all the correct and dreadful ceremony that such business required. The sky had gone the particular soft grey of a summer evening reluctant to end, and the roses along the lych gate, planted by some long-dead sexton with more sentiment than horticultural sense, nodded gently in a breeze that carried with it the first cool suggestion of the autumn to come. "There is a pattern in it somewhere," she said again, to no one but the roses, "and I do not think, whatever poor Dr. Haydock may believe, that it is a pattern which began this morning at all." She could not, of course, have imagined then that within the week the dead woman would be seen, by no fewer than 3 respectable witnesses, walking through the churchyard in the dusk, dressed no longer in white, but in unrelieved black. The vicar himself, a mild and elderly man named Mr. Clitheroe, who had christened Evelina Prentice as an infant and had confidently expected to marry her that very morning, sat for a long while afterward in his empty church, looking at the white roses wilting along the aisle, and confided to his wife that evening that he had never in 40 years of ministry felt so entirely unequal to the comfort a parish required of him. "There are griefs a clergyman knows how to speak to," he said, "the ordinary griefs of age and illness and accident, which are at least within the natural order of things, however hard to bear. But this, a girl poisoned on her wedding morning, in her own bed, in her own home, this is a wickedness I scarcely have the words to address, and I confess I am glad, this once, that Jane Marple has taken so close an interest in the matter, for I have more faith in her patience than in my own eloquence." Chapter 2. The Woman in the Churchyard. It was old Mrs. Hartwell, sexton's widow, who saw her first, and told it about the village with the particular relish of a woman who has, for the first time in a long and uneventful life, something genuinely astonishing to report. She had gone out at dusk on the Thursday following the tragedy to lay flowers upon her husband's grave, a habit of some 40 years standing, when she saw, moving among the headstones near the yew hedge, a woman in black gown, black veil drawn close about the face, walking with a slow and measured tread toward the Prentice family vault. "I called out," Mrs. Hartwell told anyone who would listen, and several who would rather not have, "for I thought at first it was Mrs. Constance come to grieve, though it seemed a queer hour for it. And she turned her head, just turned it, mind, not a word out of her, and I saw the face beneath the veil plain as I see you now, and it was Evelina Prentice, as sure as I am a living woman, and her not 5 days in her grave." The story might have been dismissed. St. Mary Mead had its share of fanciful widows, had it not been corroborated, 2 nights later, by young Tommy Ashworth, the grocer's son, who had been walking home along the churchyard path after an evening of courting he was not eager to have generally known about, and who swore upon his mother's Bible that he too had seen a woman in black moving among the graves, and that when he had summoned the courage to call out to her, she had vanished. Not walked away, mind, but vanished, behind the yew hedge, where there was no gate, no gap, and no possible egress for a living woman in a hurry. The third witness was rather more troubling to the sceptical mind, for it was Constable Palk himself, a solid and unimaginative man not given to fancies, who on the Sunday night, making his customary round past the church, saw a figure in black at the lich gate, and, upon approaching with his lantern raised, found the churchyard entirely empty. By Monday the village was in a condition that Miss Marple privately considered both foolish and, in its way, rather useful, for a village thoroughly stirred up talks a great deal more than a village merely curious, and there is nothing so valuable to the discovery of truth as an abundance of talk sifted with patience. She called that afternoon upon Dr. Haydock, ostensibly to inquire after his rheumatism, and steered the conversation, with the gentle inexorability of water finding its own level, toward the subject of Evelina Prentice's death. "I have completed the post-mortem," Haydock told her, with the particular frankness he reserved for Miss Marple alone, having learned over many years that her interest in such matters, however unbecoming it might seem in a maiden lady of her age, was invariably to some useful purpose. Poison it was, right enough, a preparation I shan't trouble you with the name of, save to say it is not the sort of thing one keeps about a country household, and not the sort of thing a person stumbles upon by accident. Someone with a knowledge of chemistry, or of medicine, prepared that dose with care. "And the appearance of the figure in the churchyard?" Miss Marple inquired, with the studied mildness of a woman asking after the weather. Haydock's mouth twitched. "I am a doctor, Miss Marple, not a demonologist. I examined the body myself. Evelina Prentice is dead, and no amount of village talk will alter that plain fact, whatever old Mrs. Hartwell may swear to over her teacups." "You do not, I think, believe in ghosts, Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said, setting down her own cup with the particular care she gave to matters she considered of real importance. "Nor, I confess, do I, in the ordinary way of things, but I have found, over a long life, that it is generally a mistake to dismiss a story merely because it is an uncomfortable one to credit. 3 separate persons, of 3 separate temperaments and 3 separate degrees of sobriety, have now given very similar accounts of what they saw, and it has been my experience that when so many different sorts of witness agree upon a single strange particular, there is very often something a great deal more solid than fancy lying beneath it." "You think someone dressed up to play a ghost, then? Some cruel village prank at a time like this?" "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that it is a great deal too soon to say what I think, Dr. Haydock, and I should not like to do either the living or the dead the disservice of guessing before I have gathered rather more thread than I presently possess. But I will say that a churchyard is a very easy place in which to be mistaken for someone else, in poor light, by a person already primed by grief and rumour to expect the extraordinary. And I have generally found that the extraordinary, examined closely enough, has a most disappointing habit of turning out to be very ordinary indeed." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "I do not suppose it will, and yet I find myself wondering, Dr. Haydock, whether it is not the plain fact itself that wants examining a little further. You are entirely certain, are you, that the woman in that bed was Evelina Prentice?" The doctor stared at her. "I have attended that girl since she was in long clothes. I should know her anywhere." "Even," said Miss Marple gently, with her face a little altered by the poison, and the room kept dim, and yourself, if you will forgive me, in a considerable hurry, with the inspector at your elbow and a house full of weeping servants pressing you to be done." There was a silence, in which the doctor's confident expression underwent a series of small, uncomfortable adjustments. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that the body was not Evelina's at all." "I am suggesting nothing whatsoever," said Miss Marple, with the particular firmness of a woman who is suggesting, in fact, a very great deal. "I am only observing that a great many people in this village have now sworn, on oath very nearly, to having seen Evelina Prentice alive and walking about the churchyard after her death was announced, and that it is generally a mistake in my experience to assume that either the living or the dead are always precisely where one has been told to expect them." Chapter 3. Old Grudges in New Dress. Ash Grange, Miss Marple had always considered, was a house that kept its secrets the way other houses kept silver, locked away, catalogued, and brought out only upon occasions of particular ceremony. She had been inside it perhaps a dozen times in as many years, generally in connection with some parish fund or other, and had formed of it an impression of chill correctness that she now found herself revising considerably. She called upon Mrs. Constance Prentice on the pretext of condolence, bringing with her, as was proper, a small pot of her own damson jam, and was received in the morning room by a woman whose black was, Miss Marple could not help noticing, of a very fine and very new cut indeed, as though it had been ordered some time before there was any occasion to wear it. "You are very good to call, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Prentice, in the flat, controlled voice of a woman keeping a tight rein upon herself, though whether from grief or from some other emotion, Miss Marple was not yet prepared to say. "It has been a dreadful time. I scarcely know how we are to go on." "It must indeed be a terrible trial," Miss Marple murmured, settling herself with the appearance of one prepared for a long and comfortable chat. "And such rumours flying about the village too. I am sure they can only add to your distress. This foolish talk of, well, I hardly like to repeat it, of your niece having been seen." Something moved behind Mrs. Prentice's carefully composed face, a flicker, gone almost before it appeared, but Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the small betrayals of the human countenance, did not miss it. "Servants' fancies," said Mrs. Prentice shortly. "Old Mrs. Hartwell has been seeing things in that churchyard since her husband died. I am surprised sensible people give it any credit at all." "Oh, quite," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "And yet Constable Palk is not, I think, a fanciful man. Nor is young Tommy Ashworth, whatever his other failings. It does seem rather a great deal of fancy for one small churchyard to sustain." She paused, and added, with the air of one making idle conversation, "I understand dear Evelina was to inherit a very comfortable sum upon her marriage, from her father's estate, was it not? Such a sad thing, that it should pass instead in quite different circumstances." The silence that followed this observation was, Miss Marple thought, considerably more informative than any answer could have been. "The terms of my brother's will," said Mrs. Prentice at last, with the careful precision of one selecting each word from a narrow and dangerous shelf, "are a private family matter, Miss Marple, and I do not think it your place to inquire into them." "No," Miss Marple agreed comfortably, "I am sure it is not. I am a great one for minding my own business, Mrs. Prentice, as anyone in the village will tell you, though I confess I have always found that other people's business has a way of walking straight into one's drawing-room, quite uninvited, and one can hardly be blamed for what happens to arrive upon one's own doorstep." Miss Marple allowed a small silence to settle, the sort of silence she had found, over many years of parish committees and charitable calls, to be a great deal more productive than any direct question could ever be, for people were forever moved to fill a silence with more than they had originally intended to say. "I am sure," Mrs. Prentice said at last into that silence, with rather more haste than the observation required, "that whatever provision my brother made for Evelina reverts, in the sad event of her death, to the family in the ordinary way. There is nothing sinister in that, Miss Marple. Whatever novels may lead foolish people to imagine, it is the way of every will in the country." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed at once, with every appearance of relief at so sensible an explanation. "I am quite sure you are right, and I am ashamed of myself for entertaining such fanciful notions even for a moment. It is only that Evelina was so very fond of you, Mrs. Prentice, by all accounts. I recall her saying to the vicar's wife, not 2 months past, how grateful she was for all you had done for her since her father's death, and how she meant that you should never want for anything once she and Mr. Hartnell were settled. It seems a cruel thing, does it not, that such affection should end so very differently from how either of you must have intended." She watched, with the mild and apparently unobservant interest of a woman discussing nothing more consequential than the weather, as Mrs. Prentice's hands, folded in her lap, tightened very slightly upon each other. It was on her way out, pausing in the hall to admire, with entire sincerity, a fine old portrait of the first prentice to build the Grange, that Miss Marple encountered Mr. Aldous Renfield, the family solicitor, letting himself out by the side door, with the particular haste of a man who does not wish to be observed leaving at all. "Mr. Renfield," she said, with such evident pleasure at the meeting, that he could hardly, in decency, hurry past her. "How fortunate! I have been meaning to ask you, quite idly, you understand. for these legal matters are far beyond a foolish old woman like myself. Whether it is not the case that a will made in favor of a bride is generally void upon her death before the marriage is solemnized. I read something of the sort once, in a novel, though I dare say novels are not to be trusted in such particulars. Renfield's face, which had been arranged into the bland unhelpfulness proper to his profession, underwent a small and unwilling change. That is, broadly speaking, correct, Miss Marple, in the case of a settlement contingent upon marriage, though I fail to see. And in the case of Mr. Prentice's own will, Miss Marple continued, with the same air of pleasant, harmless curiosity, the one under which Evelina inherited, was that sum contingent upon her marriage also, or was it hers outright, upon reaching a certain age? I only ask because it seems to me the sort of detail that might matter a very great deal to a great many people, and I should hate to see anybody suffer through my own ignorance of the facts. Renfield looked at her for a long moment, and something in his lawyerly composure seemed, for just an instant, to falter into something nearer alarm. I think, he said carefully, that you had better ask Mrs. Prentice that question yourself, Miss Marple. It is not, properly speaking, mine to answer. And with that he took his leave, rather more hurriedly than good manners strictly required, leaving Miss Marple to reflect, as she gathered her gloves and her now empty jam basket, that she had learned a very great deal indeed from a man who had told her, in so many words, nothing at all. Chapter 4. The Suitor Who Waited. Gerald Hartnell received Miss Marple in the small sitting-room of the cottage he had taken on the edge of the village some 8 months before, ostensibly to be near his intended bride, and she found him, on this her first proper visit, a good deal changed from the composed young man she had observed in the hall of Ash Grange on the morning of the tragedy. He was pale, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that spoke either of grief or of sleeplessness, of a less romantic kind, and his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady as he poured her tea. "It is very good of you to call, Miss Marple," he said. "I confess the village has not been, that is, people look at me rather oddly since it happened. I suppose it is natural. The bridegroom is always the first suspected in these affairs, is he not?" "I could not possibly say," Miss Marple replied, with perfect truthfulness, for she had in fact already given the matter a good deal of thought. "Though I will say, Mr. Hartnell, that grief takes people in such very different ways that it is generally unwise to judge a man's heart by his face alone. You had known Evelina long, I think, before your engagement was announced." "Since we were children, very nearly," said Hartnell. And here, for the first time, something genuine moved across his features, a real sorrow, or so it seemed to Miss Marple, and not the composed sorrow she had noted at the Grange. "My family had the living at Little Wexham, you know, before we removed to town, and Evelina and I played together as children, before ever her father's fortune came between us." "Came between you? Old Prentice did not think a country solicitor's son good enough for his daughter," Hartnell said, with a bitterness he did not trouble to disguise. "We were parted for the better part of 10 years. I went out to India, in a business way, and made what I could of myself, and it was only after his death that I dared come back and ask for her, with something of a fortune of my own behind me at last, to make the asking respectable." He set down his cup with a hand that shook very slightly. "We had waited so long, Miss Marple, 10 years, and then, 5 days before the wedding, you must have been very angry," Miss Marple said gently, "to have waited so long, only to lose her at the very last." He looked at her sharply. "I loved her, I do not doubt it," said Miss Marple, and found, to her own faint surprise, that she meant it. "But love and anger are not, in my experience, so very far apart as people like to believe. Nor is a long-thwarted love always a gentle one. I wonder, Mr. Hartnell, whether you were aware that Evelina's inheritance from her father was conditional upon her marriage, and that had she died before the wedding, rather than after it, the money would have passed quite differently." The colour left his face entirely. "I do not see what that has to do with anything. I do not see what you are suggesting." "I am suggesting nothing at all," said Miss Marple placidly, "beyond the observation that a very great deal of money changed its destination on account of 5 days, Mr. Hartnell, and that money is one of the oldest and most reliable motives for wickedness that the world has ever known. Very much older, I am sorry to say, than love, whatever the poets may claim to the contrary. I wonder who, besides yourself, knew of that condition in the will. He rose and went to the window, looking out over the small garden with its late summer disorder of asters and overgrown box hedging, and for a moment Miss Marple studied his back with the same patient attention she had earlier given his face. "There is something else," he said, without turning. "I did not tell the inspector, for I did not think it would be believed, and I confess I was ashamed of it besides. I went to the Grange the night before the wedding, late, past 11, meaning only to leave a note for Evelina, some foolish sentimental thing about the morning to come, for I could not sleep and could not keep away. I saw a light in the small sitting room, and voices, Evelina's and her aunt's, raised in a manner I had never before heard between them, for they were generally the gentlest of companions to one another. I did not go in. I told myself it was a private family matter and no business of mine, and I went home again without leaving my note at all, and I have wished 1,000 times since that I had had the courage to knock upon that door and ask what was wrong." "That was the under-gardener's sighting, I think," Miss Marple said quietly. "The coat by the side gate at midnight." "Yes," Hartnell said, turning back to face her at last, his expression bleak. "I did not kill her, Miss Marple, whatever the inspector may choose to believe of my coat and my convenient fortune. But I have asked myself every night since whether I might have saved her, had I only knocked." "Everyone knew," Hartnell said low. "It was hardly a secret. Mrs. Constance knew it best of all. She stood to inherit the whole sum herself, as Evelina's guardian and next of kin, should Evelina die unmarried. I do not say she did it. I only say that if you are seeking a person with reason to wish the wedding had never come off, you need not look so very far as my own cottage, Miss Marple." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the small precise click of a woman who has, in the course of an entirely pleasant conversation, learned a great deal more than she came for. "No," she said thoughtfully, gathering her gloves. "I begin to think I need not look far at all, though I confess, Mr. Hartnell, that the trouble with a house full of people who each had reason to wish a wedding prevented is that it becomes remarkably difficult to say which of them, in the end, took the trouble to prevent it." Chapter 5. A letter 20 years old. It was in the attics of Ash Grange, 3 days later, and by an arrangement Miss Marple had contrived with rather more cunning than she would ever have admitted to, that the next thread of the matter came to light. She had offered, in her capacity as a friend of the family, and a woman known throughout the village for her usefulness in matters of sorting and cataloguing, to help the housekeeper set the late Mr. Prentice's old papers in order, papers that had lain undisturbed in trunks since his death some 6 years before, and that Mrs. Constance, in the press of grief and business, had not yet found time to examine. It was among these, beneath a false bottom in an old writing desk that had belonged, the housekeeper believed, to Evelina's late mother, that Miss Marple's careful fingers found a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, gone brittle with age, and addressed, in a hand she did not at first recognize, to a "Dearest C." She read them with the particular thoroughness of a woman who considers other people's correspondence, in the pursuit of murder, entirely fair game, and found in them a story a good deal older and sadder than she had anticipated. They were love letters, written some 25 years before, from a young man signing himself only A, to a woman he addressed as his own dear Constance. And it took Miss Marple only a little further reading to establish, from references to a certain house in Little Wexham, and a certain disapproving father, that the A in question could be no other than Mr. Prentice's own younger brother, Arthur, Evelina's uncle, dead now these 20 years, drowned, so the village had always understood, in a boating accident on the river. The letters spoke of a secret engagement, forbidden by old Mr. Prentice the elder on grounds of Arthur's unsteady character and worse prospects, and of a plan to marry regardless, in defiance of the family, a plan that had come, evidently, to nothing, for Constance had married instead, some years later, a Mr. Prentice of the elder branch, the very man whose widow she now was. There was one letter, the last in the bundle and dated only weeks before Arthur's death, that gave Miss Marple particular pause. "You say I must give you up for your family's sake," it read, in a hand grown rather less steady than the earlier letters, "and that Edmund," this Miss Marple understood, was the elder Mr. Prentice, Constance's eventual husband, "will provide for you as I never could. But I tell you, Constance, that I will not simply stand aside and watch you sold to a man you do not love, for the sake of his fortune and your family's comfort. There are things I know of Edmund's business that would ruin him utterly should they come to light, and I do not scruple to use them, if it is the only way left to me of keeping you." Miss Marple sat for a long while in the dusty attic light, the letter in her hand, thinking a great many thoughts at once. Arthur Prentice had died within weeks of writing those words, drowned. An accident, the coroner had ruled, though the body had not been found for some days. Constance had married Edmund Prentice not long after, and had come, in the fullness of time, to be guardian of his daughter Evelina and mistress of Ash Grange, and a woman whose black, Miss Marple recalled, had been of a very fine and very new cut indeed. It was, she reflected, an old story dressed in new clothes, a story of thwarted love and family disapproval, and a fortune that had passed, by whatever means, into hands that had perhaps not been entirely innocent of arranging the passage. And if Evelina, in the sorting of her father's old papers before her wedding, had come upon this same bundle of letters, as it seemed entirely possible she had, for the false bottom of the desk had not been so very well concealed, and Evelina had been, by all accounts, a young woman of curiosity and intelligence, then she would have possessed, on the very eve of her marriage, a piece of knowledge that might have been exceedingly dangerous to more than one person in that house. "Old grudges," Miss Marple murmured to herself, tying the ribbon once more about the letters with great care, "have a way of outliving the people who first nursed them, and of finding, in the end, new and quite unexpected hands to carry them forward." She descended from the attic slowly, the bundle of letters tucked securely within her own handbag, rather than restored to its hiding place, for she had no intention of allowing so significant a piece of evidence to remain where anyone with reason to fear its contents might find and destroy it before she had made proper use of it. On the stairs she encountered the housekeeper, Mrs. Bream, a stout and voluble woman who had served the Prentice family for upward of 30 years, and who greeted the interruption to her dusting with evident relief. "A sad business, Miss Marple, and no mistake," Mrs. Bream said, setting down her cloth. "I said to cook only this morning, I said, there's something not right in this house, and has not been right, not since old Mr. Arthur died all those years ago, God rest him, though I was only a girl in the scullery then, and knew little enough of the family's affairs." "You remember Mr. Arthur then?" Miss Marple asked with careful casualness. "Oh, indeed, ma'am, a merry gentleman, and a great favourite below stairs, for he had none of his brother's coldness about him. There was talk, in my young day, that he'd fancied Miss Constance for himself, before ever she married Mr. Edmund, but nothing ever came of it that anybody below stairs could rightly say, and then the poor gentleman was drowned, and Miss Constance in black for the better part of a year after, though whether for Mr. Arthur or for propriety's sake, I never could rightly tell, seeing as she married Mr. Edmund himself, scarce 18 months later." Miss Marple thanked her, and continued on her way with the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman whose private suspicions have just received a most useful degree of independent corroboration. She resolved to speak to Inspector Slack that very evening, though she rather suspected, from long experience of that gentleman's methods, that he would not thank her for it. Chapter 6. The Inspector's Certainty. Inspector Slack, when Miss Marple called upon him at the small room he had commandeered at the Blue Boar for the purposes of his investigation, received her with the particular blend of impatience and reluctant respect that she had come, over the years, to expect from him. "Now, Miss Marple," he said, before she had properly seated herself, "I know you have a name in these parts for getting to the bottom of things, and I don't say you haven't been useful before now, but this is a straightforward case, or as straightforward as these things ever are. The girl was poisoned. The bridegroom is the obvious party. These fellows who wait years for a fortune don't always wait patiently, whatever they say to your face, and I have a witness, moreover, who puts him near the Grange the night before the wedding, at an hour he cannot satisfactorily account for." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, settling herself with every appearance of interested attention. "And who is this witness, Inspector, if I may ask?" "The under-gardener. Saw a man's figure by the side gate, close on midnight, and recognised the coat as Hartnell's own, a distinctive check, apparently, that Hartnell had been seen wearing about the village." Slack tapped his notebook with evident satisfaction. "Motive, opportunity, and a knowledge, for he told you himself, did he not, by your own account, of the very condition in the will that made the timing of her death so remarkably convenient to somebody. I call that a case, Miss Marple. whatever fancies the village may prefer to entertain about churchyards and veiled women. You have not, then, Miss Marple inquired mildly, given any great weight to the matter of the figure seen in the churchyard? Slack's expression made his opinion on that subject entirely plain without the need for words. Village nonsense, Miss Marple, if you'll forgive my saying so. Old women seeing ghosts, and a grocer's boy too ashamed to admit he was somewhere he oughtn't to have been, and inventing a tale to cover it, and a constable who I dare say had taken a drop more of Mrs. Hartwell's elderberry wine than was strictly wise on a cold evening. I have a poisoned girl, a motive as plain as daylight, and a man's coat seen where it had no business to be. I do not need a ghost story to complicate a case that is not, at bottom, complicated at all. And yet, said Miss Marple, I wonder whether you have asked yourself, Inspector, quite how certain we may be that the young woman found dead in that bed was, in point of fact, Evelina Prentice. Slack stared at her, as though she had proposed something faintly indecent. I beg your pardon, Miss Marple. I only observe, she continued, undeterred, that the room was kept dim on Mrs. Constance's particular instruction, I am told, out of what she called delicacy, that the doctor's examination, thorough as I am sure it was, took place in circumstances of some haste and considerable distress, and that the poison used, whatever its precise nature, is said by Dr. Haydock to alter the countenance a little, about the lips and the complexion generally. I wonder, too, whether anyone thought to compare the body found in that bed against some more particular mark, a birthmark, a scar, some old injury, such as would settle the matter beyond any possibility of doubt, rather than relying upon a general impression of a young woman in a wedding gown, in a dim room, at a moment of very great shock to everybody concerned. The inspector's confident expression had, by slow degrees, given way to something considerably less certain. You are suggesting the body was not Evelina's at all, that someone else died in that room, dressed in her gown, and that Evelina herself— I am suggesting, said Miss Marple, that it would cost very little to find out, and that a great deal may turn upon the answer. There was, I believe, a housemaid at the Grange, Ellen Farrow, who was noted as being unaccountably late to her duties on the very morning the body was discovered, and who has not, so far as I am aware, been seen by anybody in the village since that day. Though her absence has occasioned remarkably little comment, everyone's attention being taken up with grander matters. Slack set down his pen and regarded her for a long moment with an expression that suggested a considerable internal struggle between his professional scepticism and a growing, reluctant recognition that Miss Marple's fancies had, upon more than one previous occasion, proved a good deal more substantial than fancies had any right to be. You are asking me, he said slowly, to set aside a case I could take before the assizes tomorrow and have every confidence of a conviction on the strength of a missing servant and a letter you found in an attic. I am asking you, Miss Marple corrected gently, to spend one further day making certain that the case you take before the assizes is the correct one, Inspector. For I have observed, in a long life of watching such matters, that a wrong conviction satisfies nobody in the end, least of all the true culprit, who is left entirely free to arrange matters to their satisfaction, while an innocent man pays the price of their wickedness. Mr. Hartnell's coat may indeed have been at that gate, but a coat can be borrowed or copied or mistaken in poor light by a gardener half asleep at his own post, quite as easily as a face in a dim bridal chamber. The inspector was silent for a moment, turning his pen over in his fingers. One day, he said at last, grudgingly, I will give you 1 day, Miss Marple, and not an hour more, before I take my case to the Chief Constable as it stands. Chapter 7. The Housemaid Who Vanished. The discovery that Ellen Farrow had not been seen since the morning of the tragedy produced, once Inspector Slack had bestirred himself to make proper inquiry, a consternation in the village, scarcely less than that occasioned by the death itself. She was a girl of about Evelina's own age and build, as it now emerged upon careful questioning of the other servants, dark-haired, where Evelina had been fair, but a girl who might, in a dim room and a hastily glimpsed moment, with her hair concealed beneath a veil, be mistaken for her mistress by anyone not looking with particular care, and by nobody at all who had reason, however unacknowledged, to prefer the mistake. Her mother, a widow living in the neighbouring village of Much Benham, had received a letter from her, postmarked the very day of the wedding that was not, saying only that she had been offered a situation in London through the kindness of a friend and had gone to take it up at once, without time to say her proper goodbyes, and that her mother was not to worry. "But it is not like Ellen," the woman told Miss Marple, who had motored over to Much Benham with the vicar's wife on the pretext of a charitable visit, and had steered the conversation, as was her habit, with a gentleness that concealed a very considerable determination. "She would never leave a good place without a word to Mrs. Prentice, nor without coming to see me first, whatever the hurry. And the letter," here the woman hesitated and produced from a drawer a single sheet, much handled. "The letter does not sound like her at all, ma'am, if you understand me. Ellen was never one for fine words, and this reads almost as if somebody had written it out for her to copy." Miss Marple examined the letter with close attention, and found, indeed, a stiffness of phrase and a correctness of spelling that sat oddly with what she had been told of Ellen Farrow's rough country schooling. The sort of letter, she reflected, that a careful and educated hand might produce in careful imitation of an uneducated one, and not quite succeed in the imitation. "Had Ellen," she asked, "any particular friend in the household, anyone she was especially close to or confided in?" "She was thick as thieves with Miss Evelina herself, ma'am, these last months," the mother said, which was a queer thing in itself, seeing as how mistress and maid don't generally go arm in arm. "But Ellen wrote to me only a few weeks back saying that Miss Evelina had taken her quite into her confidence over some family trouble, and had said that if ever she, Ellen, needed a friend, she was to remember it." Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, turning this new information over with the same careful patience she gave to a difficult piece of knitting. "I begin to wonder," she said, half to herself, "whether Evelina Prentice, having discovered a secret in her father's old papers that placed her guardian in a very dangerous light indeed, did not take rather more drastic steps to protect herself than anybody in the village has yet imagined, and whether poor Ellen Farrow was not persuaded, out of loyalty to a mistress she had come to love, to play a part in a deception a great deal larger and more dangerous than she can have properly understood." "You cannot mean," said the vicar's wife, who had listened to all this with mounting astonishment, "that Evelina is not dead at all, that some dreadful thing has happened to that poor girl Ellen in her place?" "I mean," said Miss Marple gravely, "that I begin to fear precisely that, and that if I am right, we have very little time indeed in which to discover the whole truth of the matter, for a person who has once resorted to poison to protect a secret is not, in my experience, a person who will hesitate very long before resorting to it again, should the need arise a second time." The drive back to St. Mary Mead passed in a silence the vicar's wife did not care to break, for she had seen upon Miss Marple's face an expression she had come, over the years of their acquaintance, to recognise and to respect, the particular stillness of a mind working with great rapidity beneath an outwardly placid exterior, fitting one fact against another as a careful needlewoman fits one patch against the next, until a pattern that had seemed impossibly confused begins, by slow degrees, to resolve itself into something with edges and a shape. "We must go directly to Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said at last, as the car drew near the outskirts of the village, though I confess I do not relish the conversation, for he is not a man who takes kindly to having his certainties disturbed, and I am about to disturb them very considerably indeed. "But Evelina Prentice, if she is alive at all, has now been missing or concealed for the better part of a week, and every day that passes without the truth being known is a day in which whoever has arranged this deception has the opportunity to arrange something a great deal more final besides." Chapter 8. The Locked Room at the Grange. It was with Inspector Slack's rather grudging cooperation, obtained only after a conversation of some length, in which Miss Marple laid before him, with the patient thoroughness of a woman accustomed to being disbelieved and undeterred by it, the whole chain of small facts she had gathered, that the household of Ash Grange was assembled, 3 evenings later, in the long drawing-room, while a search was conducted of certain rooms that had, until that evening, remained closed to general inspection. It was in a small disused chamber at the top of the east stair, its door locked and the key nowhere to be found among the ordinary household keys, that Constable Palk, called in to force the lock, discovered evidence that a young woman had been kept there, a narrow bed disturbed as though recently slept in, a jug and basin, and, folded with peculiar care upon a chair, a black gown of good quality, cut for a woman of thin and youthful figure. "It is Ellen's own gown," said the cook, who had been brought up to identify it. "The good one Miss Evelina gave her last Christmas, that she was that proud of." Miss Marple, standing a little apart from the general commotion, with the particular composure of a woman whose theories are being confirmed, rather faster than even she had quite expected, turned to Mrs. Constance Prentice, who stood very white and very still in the doorway. "I think," she said, "that you had better tell us, Mrs. Prentice, precisely what became of Ellen Farrow, and precisely where her mistress is to be found this evening. For I do not believe, whatever the appearance of that unhappy body in the wedding gown, that it was Evelina who died in this house." There was a silence in which the whole household seemed to hold its breath together. "I do not know what you mean," Mrs. Prentice said at last, but her voice had lost the flat control Miss Marple remembered from their first interview, and there was something close to panic beneath it now. "I have told the inspector everything I know. My niece is dead. I identified her myself." "You identified a young woman in a dim room, in a wedding gown, with her face a little altered by poison," Miss Marple said, not unkindly, but with an unmistakable firmness. "A young woman of about your niece's age and general figure, dressed with great care in Evelina's own gown and veil." "I think you knew, Mrs. Prentice, that it was not Evelina at all, because I think you yourself, or someone acting upon your instruction, arranged that she should not be found, and that another young woman should be found in her place." "That is a monstrous accusation," Mrs. Prentice whispered. Gerald Hartnell, who had been permitted to attend upon Inspector Slack's own suggestion, for the inspector, Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction, had come a good deal further round to her way of thinking than his pride would readily allow him to admit, stepped forward at this, his face working with an emotion that seemed compounded equally of hope and dread. "If Evelina is alive," he said, "for the love of heaven, Mrs. Prentice, tell us where, before any more harm can come to her. Whatever quarrel lies between yourself and me, she is innocent of it entirely, and does not deserve to suffer for secrets that are none of her making." "It is," Miss Marple agreed gravely, "and I should be very glad indeed to be wrong in it. But I do not think I am, Mrs. Prentice, and I think the truth of the matter concerns not Evelina's death at all, but rather the death, some 20 years ago, of your own Arthur, and the fortune that has rested since then upon a foundation a good deal less solid than anybody in this house has cared to examine. I think Evelina found the letters that proved it, and I think that when she came to you with what she had found, you understood that you had a choice before you, to lose everything you had built upon that old and terrible secret, or to silence the one person who now held the power to expose it." Chapter 9. What the aunt confessed. It was some hours later, in the small hours of the morning, with Inspector Slack himself present, and taking notes of a rather different character than he had anticipated when the evening began, that Constance Prentice, worn down at last by the accumulated weight of Miss Marple's quiet and relentless questions, told the whole of it. "Arthur did not drown by accident," she said, in a voice from which all pretense had finally drained away, leaving only a kind of exhausted honesty. "Edmund knew of our attachment, knew, too, that Arthur had discovered certain irregularities in Edmund's handling of the family's trust moneys, and had threatened to expose them unless Edmund stood aside and let us marry as we had always meant to. There was a quarrel between the brothers, on the river, the night before Arthur died. I do not know exactly what passed between them. Edmund never told me the whole of it, not in 25 years of marriage, but I have known, in my heart, since the very hour I heard Arthur was drowned, that it was no accident at all." "And you married Edmund regardless," Miss Marple said, knowing, or at least fearing, what he had done. "I married him because I had nowhere else to go, and no one else left to love," Constance said bitterly, "and because a woman in my position, 25 years ago, learned very early that survival mattered a great deal more than justice. I told myself I did not know for certain. I told myself that for 20 years, Miss Marple, until Evelina came to me 3 weeks ago with Arthur's letters in her hand, and told me she meant to take the whole matter to a solicitor, not Renfield, whom she no longer trusted, but a stranger in the county town, and have the old case reopened, whatever it cost this family's name. And so," Miss Marple said gently, "you determined that she must be stopped." "I determined," said Constance with a terrible quiet precision, "that I would not lose everything a second time, Not the fortune, nor the name, nor the last 20 years of my life, built as they were upon a lie I had not the courage to examine too closely. I persuaded Ellen, poor loyal foolish Ellen, who loved Evelina and would have done anything to protect her, or so I made her believe, that Evelina's life was in genuine danger from persons unknown, and that the only way to save her was for Evelina to disappear for a time, quietly, while Ellen took her place in the wedding gown as a decoy to draw out whoever meant her harm. Ellen believed she was helping to save her mistress's life. She did not know that the draught I gave her to help her sleep through the discomfort of the imposture, for I told her the veil and gown must be worn a full day and night to be convincing, was not a sleeping draught at all. The room had gone entirely silent. Inspector Slack, his pencil moving steadily across his notebook, looked up once, briefly, to exchange a glance with Miss Marple that contained within it a considerable measure of professional chagrin and an equally considerable measure of grudging admiration, though he was far too proud a man to voice either sentiment aloud in present company. "You gave Ellen Farrow the draught yourself?" he asked, in the careful, level tone of a man determined to have every fact correct for the record, whatever the emotion churning beneath it. "With my own hand," Constance said, and here, for the first time, her composure broke entirely, and she wept, not prettily, not in the manner of a woman seeking sympathy, but with the harsh, ugly grief of someone confronting at last the full weight of what she had done. "She trusted me. She called me kind, Miss Marple, not an hour before she drank it, for I had told her what a brave thing she was doing for her mistress's sake, and she believed me, and thanked me for the chance to prove her loyalty." "And Evelina?" Miss Marple asked very quietly. "Where is she now, Mrs. Prentice? For I do not think even you capable of harming your own brother's child directly, whatever else you have done this fortnight. I think, rather, that you have kept her somewhere close, and safe in body if not in mind, believing that so long as she remained hidden, and the world believed her dead, your secret might yet be preserved a little longer." Chapter 10. The Woman Who Was Not a Ghost. Evelina Prentice was found, within the hour, in a locked room at the gamekeeper's cottage, on the far edge of the Grange estate, guarded by a manservant in Constance's particular confidence, who surrendered his post without argument once Inspector Slack's authority was made plain to him. She was thin and frightened, and had clearly been told a story a good deal more elaborate than the truth, that her life was in danger from a rejected suitor of Ellen's, that she must remain hidden until the danger passed, that Ellen had gone gladly and safely into hiding in London to help protect her, but she was alive and largely unharmed, and the relief in the room when she was brought back to the Grange that same night was, Miss Marple reflected, one of the few genuinely uncomplicated emotions the whole sad business had produced. It was Evelina herself, once the full and dreadful truth had been laid before her, of Ellen's death, and her aunt's long-buried guilt, and the manner in which her own disappearance had been used to disguise a murder never meant, perhaps, quite so far as it had gone, who was able to explain the mystery of the figure seen walking the churchyard. "It was Ellen herself," she said, white and shaking but composed, though I did not know it at the time, for I was already shut away at the cottage by then. Aunt Constance told me afterward, when she came to see that I did not lose all faith in the story she had built for me, that Ellen had grown frightened, in the days before the wedding, of the part she had agreed to play, and had gone once, in secret, to walk in the churchyard by dusk, still wearing the black gown Aunt Constance had given her, to help disguise herself for the journey to London she believed she was soon to make, and had been seen by Mrs. Hartwell and taken for a ghost. Aunt Constance let the story stand, once it had taken hold in the village. I think she saw quite quickly how usefully it clouded the whole matter, and how it turned suspicion toward fancy and away from fact. Gerald Hartnell had come with the search party to the gamekeeper's cottage, and it was he who caught Evelina as she stumbled, weak-kneed with relief and disbelief, into the cold night air, and held her as though he meant never again to permit so much as a churchyard's width of distance between them. Miss Marple, watching the reunion from a discreet distance with the vicar's wife at her elbow, felt her own eyes grow unexpectedly damp, and reflected that whatever wickedness the case had uncovered, it had at least the grace to end in a moment of entirely genuine joy. "A clever use of an accident," Miss Marple agreed, "though a wicked one, For it is generally the way of these things that a lie, once well begun, finds a great many small accidents willing to serve it, if only the liar has the wit to make use of them. Your aunt did not plan for Mrs. Hartwell's fright, nor for young Tommy Ashworth's, nor for Constable Palk's own uneasy evening at the Lich Gate. Those were simple coincidences, a nervous girl walking where she oughtn't in the dusk, and frightened villagers seeing what they had already been primed by rumour to expect. But she made good use of them once they had occurred, and that, I think, tells us a great deal about the sort of mind we have been dealing with throughout this affair. Not a wild or a foolish one, but a patient and a watchful one, turning every circumstance, however accidental, to its own advantage. Chapter 11. The Threads Drawn Together. It fell to Miss Marple, in the days that followed Constance Prentice's arrest, to explain to a still somewhat bewildered Inspector Slack, who had, to his credit, come a good deal further toward crediting her methods than he would readily have admitted, precisely how she had arrived at the truth of the matter from what had seemed, at the outset, so very unpromising a tangle of village gossip and old wives' tales. "It was never really the ghost that mattered, Inspector," she said, over the tea the vicar's wife had thoughtfully provided for what had become, in effect, a small conference upon the case. "A ghost is only ever a person misunderstood. In my experience, a perfectly ordinary human being, seen at an unexpected hour, in unexpected dress, and interpreted by frightened minds, according to whatever story is already circulating. The true puzzle, once one set the ghost aside as a symptom rather than a cause, was a much older and much more human one, who stood to lose, or to gain, by Evelina's death occurring before rather than after her wedding, and who among that number possessed both the opportunity and the particular coldness of nerve that such a poisoning required." "You suspected Mrs. Prentice from the start, then?" Slack asked, a shade defensively, for he had suspected Gerald Hartnell with considerable confidence for the better part of a week. "I suspected everybody a little, and nobody very much, until the letters," Miss Marple said. "It is generally the way of it, Inspector. One gathers small facts, as one gathers stitches upon a needle, without at first any very clear notion of the pattern they will eventually form. Mr. Hartnell had motive enough in the crude arithmetic of the will, but his grief struck me from the very first as a great deal too genuine and too clumsy in its outward expression to belong to a man clever enough to have arranged so careful a poisoning. Mrs. Prentice's grief, by contrast, was a great deal too composed, and her new mourning gown, ordered, I have since confirmed, some 10 days before there was any occasion to wear it, told its own small story to anyone troubling to notice it. And the disappearance of the housemaid confirmed what the composure of Mrs. Prentice's grief had already suggested, that the young woman found dead was not who the household believed her to be, and that somebody with knowledge of the household's inner workings and access to Evelina's own wardrobe had arranged a substitution requiring both nerve and considerable practical assistance. Once I had established that Ellen and Evelina were of a similar age and figure, and that Ellen had grown suddenly and mysteriously devoted to a mistress she had not previously been especially close to, the shape of the whole deception became a good deal clearer. A deception built, as Mrs. Prentice herself later admitted, upon poor Ellen's own loyalty and courage, turned by a cleverer and more ruthless mind to purposes that unhappy girl can never have properly understood. "It is a hard thing," Slack admitted, "to think a woman capable of poisoning an innocent girl and keeping her own niece a prisoner for a fortnight, all to protect a secret 20 years buried." "It is not so very hard, Inspector, once one has lived as long as I have," Miss Marple said, not without a certain sadness. "People do not generally set out, in youth, to become the sort of person capable of such things. They arrive there by degrees, a small compromise here, a comfortable silence there, a fortune accepted without too close an inquiry into its foundations, until one day they discover that the person they have become will do a great deal more than the person they once were would ever have believed possible." Mrs. Prentice did not begin as a murderess. She began, 25 years ago, merely as a frightened young woman choosing security over love, and every choice she made after that first one, I think, followed from it with a kind of dreadful, patient logic, until it brought her, at the last, to poison in a teacup and a girl locked away in a gamekeeper's cottage. Slack closed his notebook and regarded her with an expression that was, for once, entirely without its habitual impatience. "I do not mind admitting, Miss Marple, that I should not have got to the truth of this matter half so quickly without you, whatever I may have said at the outset. It is a lesson to me, I dare say, not to be too quick in future to dismiss a churchyard ghost as mere village fancy." "Oh, you must not think too harshly of yourself, Inspector," Miss Marple said comfortably. "You had a body, a motive, and a coat at a gate, and those are the sort of facts a sensible policeman is quite right to take seriously. It is only that facts, like people, are not always quite so straightforward as they first appear, and it is generally worth a little patience to see whether they cannot be persuaded to tell one a fuller story than the one they offer at first glance." Chapter 12. White Once More. The wedding of Evelina Prentice and Gerald Hartnell took place, in the end, a full 3 months later than had originally been planned, on a bright autumn morning that St. Mary Mead pronounced, with the particular satisfaction of a village that has weathered a considerable scandal and emerged from it with its capacity for sentiment quite intact, to be a very great deal prettier than the original date would have been in any case. Miss Marple attended in her best hat and watched with quiet pleasure as Evelina, pale still, and marked in ways that would perhaps never entirely fade by the fortnight of her captivity and the loss of a devoted friend who had died in her place, walked up the aisle of the little church in a gown of white, the same white she had chosen the first time, for she had told Miss Marple, in the quiet weeks of her recovery, that she would not let Constance's wickedness take that colour from her too, along with everything else it had already taken. "She has more courage than her aunt ever possessed," Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife, as the newly married couple emerged into the autumn sunshine to general and heartfelt cheering, "for it takes a very particular sort of bravery to choose joy again, in the very place where one has so lately been made to suffer, rather than allowing fear to make the choice instead." Constance Prentice awaited her trial in the county gaol, her confession complete and, by all accounts, her composure entirely restored to something of its old chill correctness, as though the confession itself had lifted from her a weight she had carried, unacknowledged, for a very long time. Whether she would hang for what she had done to Ellen Farrow, or whether some plea might yet be made upon grounds of the long and terrible provocation of Edmund's original crime against Arthur, was a matter Miss Marple left to wiser and more legally trained heads than her own, though she privately thought, and said as much to Dr. Haydock over a companionable game of chess some evenings later, that justice in this world was rarely so neat a thing as either its champions or its victims generally wished it to be. "You solved it in the end, all the same," Haydock said, moving a knight with more confidence than the position strictly justified. "The village owes you a debt it will never properly acknowledge, Miss Marple, though I dare say you would not thank anyone for trying." "I did very little," Miss Marple said, with the particular modesty that concealed, as those who knew her best were well aware, a very considerable satisfaction. "I only listened, Dr. Haydock, to what the village was already telling me. A ghost that was not a ghost, a grief that was too well arranged, a mourning gown ordered before its time, a housemaid who vanished without quite vanishing in the way her letter claimed. People give away a very great deal if one only troubles to watch and to listen with sufficient patience. Very much more, I think, than they ever intend to, and very much more than they themselves generally realize they possess." Ellen Farrow was buried the following week, in a corner of the churchyard not far from the yew hedge where her borrowed black gown had once been mistaken for a ghost, and the whole village turned out for it, in a spirit of proper sorrow that Miss Marple thought considerably more fitting than the sensational gossip that had earlier attended her disappearance. Gerald Hartnell insisted, and Evelina readily agreed, that the girl's mother should want for nothing for the remainder of her days, in whatever small recompense could be made for a loyalty so cruelly exploited and a life so needlessly ended. It was not justice, Miss Marple reflected, standing at the graveside in the thin autumn sunshine. Nothing could truly be justice, for a girl who had died believing herself brave and useful, betrayed by the very kindness that had made her so easy to deceive. But it was, perhaps, as close to justice as the living could generally manage to offer the dead, which was, in her long experience of such matters, very often the most that any of us could hope to do. She took his rook with the small, precise satisfaction of a woman who had, in more matters than merely chess, spent a long life learning to see what others overlooked. "There is always a pattern in the end," she said, "however strange the dress it wears at the outset. One need only have the patience to let it show itself, thread by thread, until the whole design stands plain." Outside the vicarage window, the last of the autumn light lay gold across the churchyard, where a woman in black had once been seen to walk, and would, Miss Marple reflected with quiet contentment, now be remembered by the village for nothing stranger than the ordinary, sorrowful, entirely human tragedy it had, at the bottom of it all, always actually been.